Rain poured, lightning struck, yet the man left no shadow behind. Why? Welcome to Revenge Oath. I'm your moderator, Conan Doyle. Share in the comments. Where are you following this case from today? Your thoughts illuminate every clue. Grateful to have you here. It was on a bleak morning in late October that the course of our routine at Baker Street was unsettled by one of the more curious cases I have ever recorded. The fog had rolled in heavily from the Thames, clinging to the windows like a veil, and the rain tapped steadily on the panes, giving the day a dim and dismal quality that matched Holmes' temperament when deprived of mental stimulation. My companion was stretched out upon the settee in his dressing gown, hands folded beneath his chin, eyes closed, not in sleep, but in that feline stillness of thought he so often adopted when waiting for a case to ripen. The fire crackled low, and the scent of Persian tobacco lingered in the air. "Watson," Holmes said without opening his eyes, "you have ceased taking your morning walks." I looked up from my newspaper, startled. "What makes you say that?" "The mud upon your boots has dried to the exact same crusted pattern 3 mornings in a row. Today, it is absent entirely. A shame. You were always less irritable after a brisk outing." Before I could retort, Mrs. Hudson entered with a note upon a silver tray. "From the front steps, sir. He wouldn't come in. Said he'd rather wait in the rain than be indoors too long." Holmes opened his eyes, sat up swiftly, and took the folded paper. He studied the envelope before even opening it. A thick vellum embossed in gold filigree, addressed in a hand that speaks of military precision. Yet, observe, see how the loop in the M trembles. Not nerves, but age or infirmity. He opened it, scanned the brief lines, and raised an eyebrow. "Now this is interesting." "What does it say?" I asked, already rising. Holmes passed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, I entreat your urgent assistance. I have witnessed something impossible and fear it will drive me to madness." Column Archibald Faversham, retired. Faversham. The name rings a bell. "It should," said Holmes, already striding toward the window. "Commanded the 17th Lancers in Kandahar, knighted in 1985, shot twice and decorated thrice. A man known for courage, discipline, and absolute rationality. And now he's seen something impossible." Holmes pulled aside the curtain. "He's standing across the street, Watson, in full dress, rain streaming from his hat. But look there, beneath him, what don't you see?" I joined him at the window, blinking through the downpour. "No. Shadow. Precisely." Holmes turned to me with that electric gleam in his eyes that meant the game had begun. "The man is drenched. The gas lamps are lit. Yet he casts no shadow on the pavement. What say you, Watson? Shall we step into the impossible?" Before I could answer, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson, flustered, ushered in a tall, rigid figure, a man in his late 60s, his once bronzed face pale, mustache gray, uniform impeccable. His boots left wet prints on the rug. Holmes offered his hand. "Colonel Faversham, please. You're among friends. Speak freely." Faversham remained standing. "Mr. Holmes, I have witnessed something no man should see. I have told no one but you." "Go on," Holmes said softly. The Colonel's voice dropped. "Last night, at precisely 9 o'clock, I was walking along Monsell Street. The rain had just begun. A man passed me, tall, hatless, in a grey cloak. He did not look at me, but the light from a carriage lamp illuminated the street behind him. And I swear to you, he left no shadow. None. As if the rain passed through him." Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Did you follow him?" Faversham gave a faint nod. "I did, but he turned a corner near the abandoned Edelson residence, and when I rounded it, he was gone. The street was empty. I waited. No carriage, no doors opening, nothing." Watson and I exchanged a glance. The Colonel's voice bore no sign of madness, only cold certainty. I spent my life facing bullets, Faversham said. I don't frighten easily. But this was like seeing death walk without a body. Holmes stood. Colonel, I believe you. And more than that, I believe someone wants you to believe exactly what you saw. The colonel stiffened. Then you think it was a trick? Holmes's eyes glinted. I think, sir, it was the beginning of a performance. And such performances are usually preludes to crime. Holmes stood by the hearth, the fire casting flickering shadows along the walls, save for the one cast by Colonel Faversham, which danced plainly across the floor. A shadow unmistakably present. You saw no shadow at all? Holmes repeated. No blur, no displacement of light, nothing? Nothing, Faversham confirmed. And I pride myself on observation. A commander cannot afford illusions, not in war, not in life. Holmes considered this, tapping his long fingers against his chin. You mentioned Monsell Street, narrow, uneven gaslights, cracked cobbles, an unfortunate locale for optical consistency. Still, he glanced at me. Watson, coat and cane. We'll walk. Faversham looked momentarily stunned. You mean now? Of course. Rain, like fear, washes away only the surface. If someone attempted an illusion, it's likely something was left behind. And I never trust the impossible until I've tested it with my boots. The colonel, after a moment's pause, nodded gravely. Then I'll come with you. Holmes raised a hand. No, sir. You will return home. The less you are seen on that street again, the better. Faversham stiffened, the soldier in him rising reflexively. Are you suggesting I'm being watched? I am. Suggesting that if someone staged an apparition to unsettle you, and only you, then your reaction was its reward. And its signal. Holmes moved to the bureau, retrieving a small velvet pouch which he slipped into his coat pocket. Let's not inform them it succeeded. By 10:30, we were in a hansom bound for Monsell Street, the rain now a misting drizzle that dulled the gaslight's reach and turned the paving stones to black mirrors. Holmes was quiet for much of the ride, his mind clearly whirring. As we turned the corner into the narrow crescent of Monsell Street, I understood immediately what he meant by optical inconsistency. The lamps were old and erratically spaced. Some flickered, others were entirely extinguished. The road narrowed to a point near the Addleston residence, an abandoned Georgian townhouse whose windows were boarded and whose iron gate hung crooked on its hinges. We dismounted and walked in silence. This spot, said Holmes, halting abruptly. Here, the colonel claims he lost sight of his phantom. He crouched low, examining the slick cobbles, then withdrew a small silver tube from the pouch and scattered a fine dust across the ground. It shimmered slightly under the lamplight. Iridescent powder? I asked. Magnesium and chalk blend, harmless to shoe leather but clings to foreign particles. Fibers, glass fragments, rubber. I found it helpful when the clues are unwilling to show themselves. He scanned the area as the powder settled. There, he murmured, gesturing to a patch near the curb. Observe, disturbed grit, a trace of soot and something more peculiar. I knelt beside him and saw it. A faint triangle of darker residue, as though something had pressed a precise edge into the filth. Watson, what would you suppose could leave a mark like that? I frowned. A tripod, perhaps? Or a stand of some sort. Excellent. A collapsible screen, to be exact, Holmes said. Set before a gas lamp to block its projection. Now imagine this. You walk under one lamp's glow, and then suddenly, your own shadow is cast, but not the man walking before you. His shadow should fall long, yet a screen disrupts it, blocks it entirely. Your mind doesn't reason with lamps and angles. It reasons with instinct. No shadow equals unnatural. But it was raining, I said. Wouldn't the rain expose the trick? Unless the screen was coated, oiled canvas perhaps, or the ruse was swift. Watson, consider the purpose. This wasn't meant to fool everyone. Just one man, in one moment. A perfect illusion, seen only once and never to be repeated. But why Faversham? Holmes did not answer immediately. He rose and walked toward the Addlestone gate, peering in. The interior was dark, but the boards were aged and broken in places. He tested the lock on the gate. It yielded with an eerie groan. "We'll return tomorrow in daylight," he said. "I'd wager half my library that the answer begins inside that house." On our ride back to Baker Street, Holmes remained silent, staring through the misty glass. I could see the outline of an idea taking shape, but he gave it no voice yet. By the time we returned, it was past midnight. Mrs. Hudson had retired. Holmes went directly to his desk and began to write letters. "To the War Office," he explained when I asked. "I intend to learn if Colonel Faversham has made any recent enemies or friends within the past 6 months. A man of his reputation cannot see ghosts without someone profiting from his fright." I nodded. "Do you think someone intends to harm him?" Holmes folded the letter and sealed it. "Worse. I believe someone intends to unmake him, slowly, publicly, and with the most exquisite subtlety." I started, unnerved. "But why? He's retired, isn't he?" "Yes," Holmes said, reaching for another sheet. "But retirement is not invisibility. And Faversham, for all his medals and honor, is sitting on something worth more than dignity, and someone wants him to question everything, including his own sanity." The next morning, a telegram arrived from the War Office, surprisingly prompt. Holmes read it over tea and passed it to me. "Archibald Faversham, Ret 1899. Service unblemished. Consulted last spring on Committee for Parliamentary Oversight of Defense Contracts. Testified in closed session against Threshold Engineering. Contract denied. Disputed. Loss exceeds £50,000. Holmes smiled, wolf-like. "There, Watson. A motive, revenge. Number, reputation. Threshold Engineering is a shell of a firm. Their designs are stolen, their testing falsified. But they had backing from powerful men, politicians, investors. When Faversham spoke against them, he broke the gears of a machine much larger than he likely knew." I shook my head. "So this shadowless figure is part of a campaign," Holmes concluded. "Not to kill Faversham, but to discredit him, to make the man who exposed their fraud appear delusional. Imagine, Watson, the man who saw a ghost in the rain, babbling of shadows that weren't there, suddenly remembered for madness rather than honor. But to what end?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Because another vote is pending next month, if Faversham's testimony can be revoked or he's deemed unreliable, Threshold's contract may be reconsidered. £50,000 could be reinstated with a single reversal." Just then, a knock at the door announced a visitor. Mrs. Hudson returned, bearing a telegram. Holmes read it and frowned. "Colonel Faversham has taken ill. His housekeeper reports a sudden collapse, hallucinations, fever, and speaking to men who aren't there." I felt a chill trace my spine. "He was perfectly lucid yesterday," I said. "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "which means this campaign has escalated. They've begun attacking his body as well as his mind." He moved, quickly, retrieving his cloak and hat. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To Addlestone House, Watson. There's no more time for caution. If I am correct, the ghost of Monsell Street was never meant to be seen again, but perhaps it left behind more than just the absence of a shadow." We stepped once more into the fog. The game, as ever, was afoot. The drizzle had returned by the time we arrived once more at Monsell Street, a thin, steady patter that turned the cobblestones into slick, glistening mirrors. Holmes stood before the rusting gate of the Addlestone residence, examining the lock again with the faintest curl to his lip. "This padlock is ornamental at best," he muttered. "A relic from a time when this house had valuables worth defending. Watson, your assistance, if you please." Together, we pushed open the gate. its hinges screeching softly like a warning sigh from the house itself. We ascended the stone steps, Holmes pausing only briefly to check the jamb of the front door. He drew a thin strip of black paper from his pocket and pressed it along the crack near the latch. No scratches? No tampering, but we'll not risk the front. The side alley may offer quieter ingress. We made our way to the rear, where a row of broken bins stood like sentries and a leaning fence separated the property from the lane. Holmes crouched and produced a narrow tool from within his walking stick, something between a pry bar and a skeleton key, and with a quick twist of the wrist, the kitchen door gave way. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty breath of a home long forgotten. Water from the leaky eaves pooled in corners of the floor. The old boards creaked underfoot. We lit our lantern and stepped cautiously into the gloom. The interior had been stripped bare. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, save for a narrow trail that led from the back hallway toward the parlor at the front. Holmes crouched again. Boot prints, medium-sized, recently made. See here, the partial smudge where rain met dust. This wasn't made during the last storm. It's too crisp. Someone has been here since the colonel saw his specter. We followed the prints, our boots muffled by the thick grime. The parlor bore signs of recent activity. A small patch of the wall had been wiped clean of dust. An empty crate stood near the window, and in the corner, most tellingly, lay a coil of canvas, oiled and folded, its brass rivets still gleaming. Holmes approached it with reverence. This was no tarpaulin discarded by squatters, he said. This was precision cut. See the holes along the edge? Mounted on a frame, a screen, just as I suspected. Designed to block light or manipulate it. I frowned. But it would take at least 2 men to stage the illusion from here. One to set the screen, another to guide the subject. Holmes smiled thinly. No, Watson, it would take one. A man with foresight and a knowledge of how the colonel walks. Observe, the window faces the exact lamp under which Faversham saw his phantom. The light, filtered through gauze or glass here, could be altered, muted, redirected. He gestured to the floor beneath the window where faint tracks led back and forth. And a mirror, he added, pointing to a scuffed circle. Propped up here, angled just so, enough to throw the image of the road back toward itself, creating the illusion of space while hiding the source. So it wasn't merely the absence of shadow, but the presence of false geometry? Precisely. I shook my head in amazement. But why go to such elaborate lengths? Surely a less subtle fright would suffice to rattle even a strong man. Holmes turned, his face grave. Because subtlety makes the victim question his own faculties. Once a soldier doubts his own senses, it is not long before others do the same. He stepped forward, peering closer at the coil of canvas. Watson, do you smell that? I inhaled. Chemical, not just oil. Something else. Holmes nodded. Ether, faint but present. Our illusionist has been experimenting, not merely with light and shadow, but with sensation. It's entirely possible Faversham was lightly dosed. But he said he was alone. Holmes interrupted. He thought he was alone. Consider, a man passes him on the street, casts no shadow. Moments later, the colonel rounds a corner, finds nothing. What if, in that brief moment of turning the corner, he inhaled a faint mist? Something sprayed or released near the gate. Just enough to cloud the memory, slow the reflexes. Which would also explain his sudden collapse today, I murmured. Holmes nodded. Yes, but that means the campaign is moving faster than I thought. He stood, his gaze sweeping the room once more. We've seen what we came for. Let's not linger. We returned to Baker Street in silence, Holmes absorbed in thought. Back at our rooms, he sent out 2 telegrams, one to Lestrade, summoning him discreetly to join us the next morning, the other to an apothecary in Marylebone, requesting a review of recent purchases involving ether or similar compounds made in bulk. "Do you think Lestrade will take this seriously?" I asked. "If he doesn't, he will soon," Holmes replied. "But for now, rest. Tomorrow we speak to the housekeeper." It was just after 9 when Mrs. Mercer arrived at Baker Street, her bonnet trembling with rain. A stern woman in her 50s, she had served the Colonel since before his retirement. "I don't know what's come over him," she said, gripping her gloves tightly. "He woke in the night shouting nonsense. Said there was a man standing in the corner, but when I brought the doctor this morning, he insisted he'd been alone all night." Holmes nodded sympathetically. "Has he been receiving visitors?" "None lately. Not since the meeting with the Oversight Board 3 weeks ago. Just a few letters. One, from a solicitor I didn't recognize." Holmes perked up. "A solicitor?" "Yes. Name of Triggs, I believe. Left no address. Just a folded envelope. I found it tucked beneath the decanter tray in the parlor. Looked like it had been read and hidden." Holmes exchanged a look with me. "Mrs. Mercer, could you fetch that envelope and bring it here?" "Of course, sir." When she had gone, Holmes turned to me, pacing. "Triggs. That name rings false. There is no registered solicitor in the London registry under that name. It's a pseudonym." He strode to the window, staring out into the mist. "Whoever orchestrated this campaign is clever, but clever men, Watson, often overreach. The illusion was too perfect, too specific. And now they must cover their tracks." An hour later, Mrs. Mercer returned, breathless, empty-handed. "It's gone," she exclaimed. "The envelope, I know where I left it, but it's vanished. The tray's been disturbed." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then someone's been in the house again, while the Colonel was ill." I could see the thought forming even before he said it. "They're accelerating, Watson. We must act before the Colonel is declared not merely delusional, but unfit." "What do you intend?" Holmes stepped forward, face hardening. "I intend to unmask the man with no shadow, but to do so, we must let him believe his illusion still holds." "You're going to lay a trap." "I already have," he said. "Now we wait for the bait to twitch." And with that, the storm outside broke, and the shadows lengthened once more across the fog-bound streets of London. The following morning dawned grey and grim, the kind of day Holmes relished. Mist hung low over Baker Street, blurring outlines and muffling footsteps, a cloak over the city that concealed more than it revealed. Holmes had risen early, earlier than I had seen him rise in weeks, and was already at work in his armchair, a clutter of notes, diagrams, and maps spread out before him like the battlefield of some intellectual war. "Watson," he said without looking up, "our quarry has begun to circle its own trap. I've taken the liberty of inviting an old acquaintance to assist us today, Inspector Lestrade, who should be arriving shortly." Lestrade arrived not 10 minutes later, his coat speckled with drizzle, his expression equal parts irritation and curiosity. "You've got me out of bed early, Holmes. This had better be more than a ghost story." Holmes steepled his fingers. "I wouldn't trouble Scotland Yard with mere phantoms, Lestrade. But if I told you that a respected colonel had been made to question his own sanity with the precision of a surgical campaign, would that interest you more?" Lestrade sighed. "You're referring to Colonel Faversham. Yes, I've heard about his collapse. His doctor contacted the Yard, some concern over his mental health. Rumors, mostly. Said he'd seen a man in the street without a shadow. It's making the rounds in Whitehall." "Exactly the problem," Holmes said. "This isn't madness, Lestrade. It's a deliberate operation, an attack of the most insidious kind. Faversham gave testimony that cost a powerful firm a fortune. Now someone wants that testimony discredited." "Holmes?" Lestrade crossed his arms, wary. "What you're describing is beyond criminal mischief. It's slander, conspiracy, possibly sedition." Holmes's smile thinned. "Now you're beginning to see the shape of it." He handed Lestrade a map marked with notations in Holmes's spare, tidy hand. "I believe the illusion, this shadowless figure, was engineered from within the abandoned Addlestone house on Monsell Street. We found a mounted screen, evidence of chemical agents and signs of recent use. But that's not enough. We need a name, and I believe we're close. Holmes rose, gesturing to both of us. We are paying a visit to a man named Quentin Dare. Lestrade blinked. Who? A theatrical illusionist, Holmes explained. Specialist in shadow play and optics. He was once engaged by a naval propaganda firm to stage battlefield simulations. Now he is discreetly employed. By whom, I intend to learn. We took a cab through the winding lanes of Soho and arrived at a nondescript door off Beringer Court. A tarnished plaque beside it read, Q. Dare, Optical Illusions and Stagecraft. Holmes rapped smartly. A man answered, a wiry figure in his 40s with thinning blonde hair, ink-stained fingers, and eyes that flicked from Holmes to Lestrade with feline awareness. His waistcoat bore burn marks and traces of glass dust. Mr. Dare, Holmes said evenly, we require a few moments of your time. I'm Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson, and this is Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. Dare's lips thinned, but he stepped aside. Come in, then, but you'll find I'm no magician. The room inside was packed with peculiar instruments, angled mirrors, slotted wheels, painted screens, and lens rigs. Along one wall stood a mannequin dressed in a grey cloak, its back to us. Holmes moved through the clutter like a hound, eyes scanning details. You've done work for the government before, have you not? Occasionally, Dare said. Stage work, mostly. A few demonstrations, nothing illegal. Of course not, Holmes murmured. And yet the screen we recovered from Eddlestone House bears your stamp. Beneath the rivets, a mark barely visible, QD etched in acid. It's your manufacture. Dare stiffened. I sell my materials to private clients. I don't ask how they use them. But surely you remember who requested a collapsible black canvas screen with side struts and brass fittings, custom cut to 6 feet, delivered a fortnight ago? Dare hesitated, then muttered. Man named Ellery. Gave a false address, paid in notes. Holmes's expression hardened. Describe him. Mid-50s, trim, black gloves. He wore a scarf high on the neck like he was hiding something. Educated voice, sharp, didn't say much, just knew exactly what he wanted. And he insisted the delivery be made after dark. Lestrade stepped forward. Could you identify him if you saw him again? Probably not, Dare said. But he left a calling card when I hesitated. Just initials, TE in red ink, that's all. TE, I repeated aloud. Threshold engineering. Holmes gave a sharp nod. Thank you, Mr. Dare. You've been most helpful. As we left, Lestrade turned to Holmes. This is your proof. We can subpoena Threshold's directors. No, Holmes said. They'll deny it. The man who purchased the screen was not acting under his own name. They'll say he was a rogue element. Dismiss him, erase him. We need to catch him in the act. Then what's your plan? Holmes looked up at the sky where the clouds were breaking into bruised light. We stage an illusion of our own. That evening, Holmes's plan took shape in full. He had arranged for Colonel Faversham's house to appear empty. The colonel himself had been moved to a private clinic under pretext of medical treatment. A note, false but convincing, was left on the doorstep to suggest he had returned from the clinic that evening. Lamps were turned on. A fire was lit in the study, and Holmes and I waited across the street in a borrowed flat, the curtains slightly parted. This man, T.E., whoever he is, Holmes said quietly, will likely attempt one final discrediting act. Something that seals the colonel's fate. An apparent fit, a public display, perhaps even an arrest. But if he suspects the colonel is back, alone and vulnerable, he will come to finish what he began. We waited. For hours, nothing stirred but the wind. Then, just after midnight, a shape emerged from the mist. A man in a dark overcoat and scarf approached the Faversham home. He paused. looked both ways, then produced a small object, something like a fine aerosol tube, and stepped lightly up the path. Holmes gripped my arm. "There," he whispered. "See how he avoids the gaslight. He knows how light betrays him." The man reached the door and examined the note. He slipped something into his coat. Then, glancing up, he moved around the side toward the back. Holmes rose swiftly. "Come, Watson. Lestrade will meet us at the alley. Time to greet the man who casts no shadow." We descended the stairs and crossed the street silently, cutting behind the house through the narrow lane. As we rounded the corner, a figure emerged, startled, caught mid-motion. A long gray cloak trailed behind him. In his gloved hand, a second canister glinted. Holmes raised his voice. "Mr. Ellery, if that is your name, stand still." The man hesitated, then bolted. Lestrade sprang from the shadows and caught him at the waist. There was a brief, ugly struggle. Then the man was restrained, his breath heaving in the cold night air. "Get his scarf," Holmes said. I moved quickly and unwrapped the long cloth. Beneath it was a scar, a burn or chemical mark running up one side of his neck, raw and red. "Identification," Lestrade snapped. The man sneered. "You have no proof." Holmes reached into the man's pocket and retrieved a second object, a folded mirror, and tucked beneath it a card. "TE that," Holmes said, "is quite enough." As Lestrade snapped on the cuffs, Holmes straightened and turned to me. "Well, Watson, no ghost, no madness, just a criminal of uncommon precision and a shadowless trick undone by the very light he tried to avoid." And with the dawn rising, pale and watchful over Maunsell Street, the man with no shadow was finally brought into the light. We returned to Baker Street in the dawn's first light, Ellery now firmly in Lestrade's custody, though the man had offered little more than sneers and cryptic silence on the ride back to Scotland Yard. Holmes, however, was far from triumphant. He sat deep in thought, elbows on knees, his fingers laced beneath his chin, and his eyes fixed upon a spot on the carpet as if it might offer the final piece in a still incomplete puzzle. "You doubt the man's guilt?" I asked, offering Holmes his tea, though he barely acknowledged it. "No, Watson. Ellery is involved, certainly. But not the mind behind this. He is, how shall I say, an executioner of schemes, not their architect. Every detail of this campaign has been too intricate, too patient. Ellery is skilled in optics, but he lacks the subtlety for psychological ruin. Someone else set this wheel turning." I glanced at the clock. "You think the case is not yet closed?" "I know it is not," Holmes replied sharply. "Ellery was sent to discredit the colonel publicly. But what if his mission was not solely about Faversham? Surely he was the target. No." Holmes sprang to his feet and paced. "Faversham was the instrument. He stood in the way of a lucrative contract, yes, but more than that. He was a trusted, decorated officer. His words carry weight in Parliament. Discrediting him was not only revenge, it was groundwork." I frowned. Groundwork for what? For silencing others? What better warning to whistleblowers than the public unraveling of one of their own? There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, handing Holmes an envelope. "No sender, sir. Delivered by a boy in gloves who wouldn't wait for a reply." Holmes opened it. His eyes scanned the page, then darkened. He passed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, your meddling has become tiresome. Colonel Faversham's condition will deteriorate, regardless of your interference. You have chased a shadow, but the light is mine to command. Withdraw. There are other men in better health and with clearer reputations. I need only one more to fall." I set the note down slowly. "He's threatening someone else now?" Holmes nodded grimly. "And he believes he has succeeded already." He returned to the map he'd been sketching earlier, a set of locations surrounding Whitehall and its adjoining clubs and government offices. "Watson, think. Who else sat on that oversight board? Faversham was the loudest voice, but he did not vote alone. If one voice brought down the threshold bid, there must be at least one more who stood with him, and if this T intends to strike again, that man must now be in danger. Holmes began writing names. Colonel Harris, Lord Collingwood, Sir Edmund Braithwaite, and, George Harrow. I blinked. Harrow, the banker. I thought he had no military ties. Precisely, said Holmes, which is why his presence on a defense committee raised questions from the start. But Harrow has something no colonel or lord possesses. Financial oversight. He's the one who followed the money trail that revealed Threshold's inconsistencies. You think he's the next target? Holmes was already pulling on his coat. I know it. He's the keystone of their financial undoing. Remove him, and the others may crumble under pressure. Within the hour, we were in Pall Mall, where Harrow maintained a residence above his private offices. The man was in his early 60s, trim, with wire spectacles and a permanently weary expression. He welcomed us with more surprise than suspicion. I'd heard of your involvement with Faversham's situation, he said, leading us into a richly appointed study. But I'm not sure what I can offer. I've had no threats, no intrusions. Not yet, Holmes said. But have you received any strange communications? Notes, packages, unfamiliar visitors? Harrow rubbed his chin. There was one odd thing. Yesterday afternoon, a messenger delivered a sealed folio addressed in heavy ink, no return address. When I opened it, it was blank, nothing but fine parchment. I assumed it was a prank. Where is it now? I discarded it. Holmes's eyes darkened. Watson, this is no prank. This is a warning, a symbolic one. A blank page suggesting that your record, like your reputation, can be erased. Harrow looked shaken. But why? I have nothing to hide. That's precisely why you're dangerous to them, Holmes said. You're incorruptible and visible. They can't buy your silence, so they intend to fabricate it. Harrow sat down heavily. Then what do I do? You stay under watch, Holmes said. Tonight you remain here, with your staff close. Do not answer any knock at the door unless it is myself or Doctor. Watson, I believe the man behind this affair is preparing one final blow, and I intend to be waiting when he strikes. By nightfall, Holmes had made his preparations. He stationed a trusted plainclothes constable at the rear of Harrow's building and had Lestrade discreetly positioned in the alleyway opposite. Harrow's gas lamps were lit at every window to suggest occupancy, while Holmes and I waited in the guest chamber, listening for the faintest sound beyond the tick of the clock. It was nearing 2 a.m. when Holmes, who had been seated motionless for nearly an hour, stood abruptly. There. I followed his gaze to the thin shadow of movement on the frosted glass of the stairwell window. A figure approached, slowly, cautiously, then paused outside Harrow's door. Holmes was already moving. With a silent nod to me, we stepped out of the chamber and crept to the foyer. The man at the door was tall, dressed in a workman's coat, a flat cap pulled low, and a satchel slung across his shoulder. He knelt, producing a fine wire and a tiny glass vial. Holmes acted. "Stop where you are." The figure startled, but did not flee. "Very well, Mr. Holmes," came the cool voice from beneath the cap. "You're quicker than most." He stood, revealing a narrow, elegant face, clean-shaven, aristocratic, and utterly without remorse. "Who are you?" Holmes asked. The man gave a faint bow. "Tremaine, Charles Tremaine, formerly of Threshold Engineering, now freelance operative, or saboteur if you like grand words." "You sent Ellery?" "Yes," Tremaine said simply, "and 3 others before him, all quite competent, but Faversham was the final warning. Harrow was to be the first removal." "What was in the vial?" "A hallucinogen, tasteless, to be slipped beneath the door and into his tea. You'd be amazed how easy it is to appear mad with the right tincture." In 3 weeks, he'd be dribbling into his cuff. An unfortunate fate. Holmes's voice was ice. Why? Why ruin lives for a failed contract? Tremaine's eyes glittered. Because we were promised something. And when powerful men break promises, they must be taught that no man is untouchable. Not even a colonel with medals or a banker with a conscience. Lestrade stepped from the shadows with 2 constables and took Tremaine into custody. As he was led away, Tremaine turned back to Holmes. "You win this round, Mr. Holmes, but they'll still get the contract. You've exposed me, not them." Holmes stood silent as the man vanished into the misty night. When the last echo of the carriage wheels faded, I turned to him. "Do you think he's right?" Holmes's expression was unreadable. "They may yet receive their prize, Watson, but not without paying dearly for it, in full view of Parliament, the courts, and the press." He sighed, weary now, the adrenaline fading. This was not a case of murder, but of character assassination, and that, Watson, is in many ways a more terrible crime, for it kills slowly and with civility. And with that, we turned back toward Baker Street, where the gas lamps still flickered bravely against the dawn, and the shadows once more fell where they belonged. The events of that night remained with me for days, lingering in my mind like the scent of fog-drenched streets and burnt ether. And though Tremaine was behind bars, the case, in Holmes's view, remained far from over. He was restless, even irritable, a state I'd come to recognize not as defeat, but as an acute dissatisfaction with loose ends. For though we had apprehended the saboteur, the hand that had guided Tremaine, financed Ellery, and orchestrated the entire campaign against Faversham and Harrow had yet to be revealed. "You must understand, Watson," Holmes said on the 3rd morning after Tremaine's arrest, pacing the length of our sitting room like a caged animal, "that Tremaine was not acting alone. A man like that does not risk so elaborate a campaign unless he has been assured of protection." "Protection from prosecution?" I asked. "From consequence," Holmes snapped. Tremaine believed himself shielded. Politically, financially, he believed that even if he were caught, the larger machinery would continue turning. And in that, he may not have been wrong. He paused by the window, frowning out at the haze-shrouded street. "Did you notice how calmly he spoke during his arrest? How candid he was, even defiant? It was not arrogance, it was strategy. He wanted to be heard. He wanted us to think the true culprit was untouchable." "Then why speak at all?" I asked. "Why not remain silent?" Holmes turned slowly. "Because silence would have suggested fear. Tremaine needed to present himself as a man with nothing to lose. But men like that always have something to protect." Just then, Mrs. Hudson knocked and entered with a slim envelope bearing the wax seal of Scotland Yard. Holmes broke the seal and scanned the note. "Lestrade. He's just finished interrogating Tremaine again. Still no new names. But something else. Tremaine has retained legal counsel, a solicitor named Marcus Vell." The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Marcus Vell," he muttered. "That, Watson, is the final stone." "Who is he?" "A lawyer by profession, but a broker by trade. A shadowy figure, rarely in the press, but always at the edge of government scandals. Vell doesn't represent clients. He represents interests. He's the man one hires when one wishes to stay out of court entirely." "Then he's protecting someone." "More than one someone, I suspect," Holmes said, already reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson. We're going to the temple. If Vell is involved, then the true architect of this campaign may yet be within reach." The chambers of Marcus Vell were located in a quiet corner of Inner Temple, the law offices there arranged like a honeycomb for the discreet dealings of powerful men. The building was old, ivy-clad, and unmarked beyond a brass knocker and a discreet sign. We were shown in by a secretary who neither blinked nor smiled, and after a few minutes, Vell himself emerged from his office. He was a man of perhaps 50, with thinning auburn hair, soft hands, and the manner of one who had long grown used to controlling conversations without raising his voice. "Mr. Holmes," he said with a slight bow. "And Dr. Watson." "A pleasure. To what do I owe the visit?" Holmes did not return the bow. "You are representing Charles Tremaine." "I am," said Vell, "though I must confess I do so more as a gesture of professional courtesy than legal necessity. Mr. Tremaine has expressed a wish to make certain statements." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And in return?" Vell's smile never quite reached his eyes. "In return, his associates prefer that those statements do not include names." "Of course," Holmes said coldly. "And those same associates, do they include members of Parliament, financiers, or perhaps defense contractors still eager to secure a lucrative bid?" Vell gave a small sigh, as if Holmes had disappointed him. "Mr. Holmes, this is all rather speculative. My client is a man with a complicated past and a highly suggestible nature. Surely you don't believe this was anything more than a bitter man seeking revenge?" Holmes stepped forward, eyes gleaming. "On the contrary, Mr. Vell, I believe this was a calculated campaign waged with surgical precision. Tremaine had resources beyond his station, knowledge beyond his profession, and access that could only have been granted by men within government walls." "Men you've advised?" Vell's smile faltered, only slightly. Holmes leaned in, lowering his voice. "You may silence Tremaine, Mr. Vell, but can you silence Colonel Faversham or George Harrow? Can you silence the reports, the evidence in the Addlestone house, the testimony of a dozen witnesses?" "I can remind them," Vell said, suddenly crisp, "that public disgrace is not exclusive to one side of a dispute. I can remind them that personal histories are not always as noble as the press makes them seem." "A threat?" I asked, stepping forward. "A prediction," Vell replied. "This is a city of glass houses, Doctor. Watson, men who hurl stones often forget their own walls." Holmes straightened. "Then allow me to offer a prediction of my own, Mr. Vell. The Yard will press charges against Tremaine within the week. My reports will reach the Home Secretary. I dare say you will find it harder than usual to operate in shadows once that light is cast." Vell gave a dry laugh. "You overestimate the power of sunlight, Mr. Holmes. It doesn't reach far in London." On the cab ride back, I expected Holmes to rage, to fume over Vell's smug evasions. But instead, he was quiet, thoughtful. "Have we failed then?" I asked finally. "No," Holmes said. "Vell's visit was a victory. He wouldn't have bothered unless his clients were afraid. And fear, Watson, is a crack in the foundation. But what do we do next? We give them one final push." That evening, Holmes penned a letter, not to the Yard, nor to any official body, but to the Times, requesting an appointment with their chief political editor. When I inquired, he smiled. If the courts can be bent and the committees silenced, there remains one force still harder to bribe: public opinion. 3 days later, an article appeared on the second page of the Times, unsigned but evidently written by someone with intimate knowledge of the case. It recounted in damning detail the attempts made to discredit a retired colonel and a sitting board member of a government oversight committee, all to secure a controversial defense contract. It made no direct accusations, but it raised enough eyebrows that Parliament was compelled to open an inquiry. Vell's clients had remained in the dark until Holmes turned on the light. By week's end, Tremaine withdrew his plea for counsel and submitted a full confession to the Crown. In it, he named 3 individuals, 2 junior ministers and 1 industrial financier, all connected to Threshold Engineering. Arrests followed. The contract was suspended permanently. And Colonel Faversham, restored in dignity, received a formal apology from the Oversight Board. The morning that news broke, Holmes returned from his walk and dropped the Times onto the breakfast table with a smirk. "London sleeps with one eye open now, Watson," he said, "and thanks to us, it remembers that even shadows cannot hide forever." I looked at the headline. "Engineer of Disgrace, Campaign of Ruin Unmasked." "And what of Vell?" I asked. Holmes poured his tea, eyes gleaming. "Ah, Mr. Vell. He's already working on his next client. But his name is no longer whispered in Power's corridors. It is spoken aloud, with caution." He leaned back, satisfied. "For now, Watson, we rest. The shadow is gone, the rain has passed, and London, for the moment, is in the sun." It was a rare thing to see Holmes at rest, and yet, in the days following the publication of the exposé in the Times, he allowed himself a luxury that bordered on idleness. Late mornings in his dressing gown, silent afternoons with his violin, and even a brief moment of conversation with Mrs. Hudson about the weather, which, given his usual disdain for small talk, signaled a most profound state of contentment. But I knew better than to mistake this stillness for complacency. Holmes was, in his way, listening. "Something troubles you," I remarked one fog-heavy morning as he stirred at the window, watching the street with an absent gaze. "Not trouble, Watson," he murmured. A whisper, faint but familiar. "You mean the case isn't finished?" "I mean," he said, turning toward me, "that while the orchestra has packed away their instruments, the conductor has yet to bow." He walked to the desk and opened a slim notebook, the same in which he had recorded every step of the Faversham affair. I watched as he flipped past pages filled with diagrams of the illusion apparatus, chemical compound lists, witness statements, and, finally, a single name, circled twice in dark ink: Marcus Vell. "He's still at the heart of this," Holmes said. "Tremaine's confession was comprehensive. Yes, but it was too clean, too generous. It reads as though dictated. Every name included has already been stripped of power or position. But Vell remains untouched." I frowned. "Perhaps because Tremaine feared him." "No," Holmes said, "because Vell promised him something: protection, leverage, or perhaps the prospect of return. A spider does not abandon his web because one fly wriggles loose." As if summoned, a knock echoed on our door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes opened it and read aloud: "Holmes, meet me urgently. House of Lords entrance, 3 o'clock. Matter concerning Vell. Discretion essential. G.H." "George Harrow," I said. Holmes nodded. He wouldn't risk this unless something new had surfaced. And if he's right, we may have only brushed the surface of Vell's involvement. At precisely 3 o'clock, we arrived at the west entrance of the House of Lords, where Harrow awaited us, looking markedly less composed than the last time we had seen him. His cravat was loose, his gloves mismatched, and a thin line of perspiration clung to his brow despite the chill. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said in a low voice, "I'm grateful you came. I mustn't be seen speaking long." "What's happened?" Holmes asked at once. "I've received a letter," Harrow replied. "Delivered not to my residence, but to my club, unmarked, folded into my newspaper. No envelope, just a single sheet." He handed it to Holmes. It was handwritten in an angular, elegant hand, clearly practiced, but impersonal. "Mr. Harrow, withdraw from all further testimony. Declare memory fault. Say you were pressured. Do this by week's end or face a public unmaking. You saw what happened to Faversham. You know how easy it is." "MV, memory fault," I murmured. "They want him to feign forgetfulness?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. A final safeguard. With Faversham's name restored, Harrow is now the last credible voice linking Threshold's fraudulent practices to figures in government. If he recants, the case collapses. "I won't do it," Harrow said. "But I fear they won't stop at threats." "They won't," Holmes agreed. "But they've made a tactical error by threatening me." "No," Holmes said, slipping the letter into his coat. by revealing that Vel is now operating without intermediaries. He stepped out of the shadows, which means he's growing desperate. We accompanied Harrow back to his residence and set a rotating guard of plainclothes men from the yard. Quiet, professional, and loyal to Lestrade, who, despite Holmes's ribbing, had proven invaluable since Tremaine's arrest. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street that evening, both of us quiet, though for different reasons. I was troubled by the escalation, by the reach of Vel's influence, by the knowledge that even when the web is exposed, its builder can remain untouched. Holmes, on the other hand, was working through something. "Watson," he said suddenly as we ascended the stairs, "do you recall that Tremaine purchased the illusion screen from Quentin Dare with cash and gave a false name?" "I do. And yet the screen bore his own initials, the acid-etched T.E. "Yes?" Holmes turned to me, expression sharpening. "That wasn't a mistake." "You mean he wanted it traced back to him?" Holmes nodded. "Tremaine was a pawn, but one who left a trail by design. He wanted to be caught, or at least, he wanted us to get close." I blinked. That makes no sense. Why expose himself? "Because exposure was safer than silence," Holmes said. He was afraid. Not of the law, but of what silence might mean to those who'd hired him. He named men who were already ruined because it spared him from naming the ones who still held power. Holmes flung open his notes and drew out Tremaine's confession again. "Read it carefully. What do you see in common among the three names he gave?" I scanned them. Minister Roland Hexton, Director Julian Bream, Lieutenant Colonel Mavis. Each had connections to Threshold Engineering, I said slowly, and all three were dismissed or resigned recently. Holmes tapped the paper, and all three were, at one point, clients of Marcus Vel. He turned to his desk drawer and withdrew a file marked VELLM. I had seen it once before, compiled years ago when Holmes had tangled with the solicitor during a lesser-known insurance swindle. "Look here," he said. "Financial records from a case in '93. Vel received retainers through intermediaries, shielded from inquiry. The pattern is the same, layer upon layer of separation, but always terminating in a quiet fee to a trust under Vel's name." "And you think those same mechanisms are at work now?" Holmes nodded. "Tremaine couldn't name the real architects, but he pointed toward them, and Vel sits at the nexus." That night, Holmes drafted a final letter, this time not to the press nor to Lestrade, but directly to Sir Gideon Marsh, the newly appointed Attorney General. The letter was a masterpiece of precise reasoning. It outlined the case against Tremaine, catalogued the history of Vel's associations, and provided enough detail to demand a grand jury review. Holmes concluded it with a simple line: "If justice is to be preserved, it must be blind not to influence, but to fear. There is enough light now to cast every shadow." S.H. Within 48 hours, a summons was issued for Marcus Vel. The day he was brought before the magistrate, London awoke to a new headline: "Solicitor to power under scrutiny. Web of influence exposed." The inquiry would take weeks, perhaps months. But the air had shifted. Vel was no longer above suspicion. He was the subject of it. The following evening, as Holmes and I sat before the fire, I found myself reflecting on the long course of the case. From the quiet knock on our door that wet October morning to the headlines now lining every kiosk. "You said once that character assassination was worse than murder," I reminded Holmes. "And I still believe it," he replied. "But this time, Watson, we revived a reputation, two, in fact." He reached for his pipe. "We did not simply solve a crime," he said. "We removed the mask from a method, one that has operated unseen for far too long." "Do you think Vel will be convicted?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "Eventually. Men like him believe themselves untouchable until the floor gives way beneath them." He glanced toward the window, where the rain had begun once more to tap gently against the glass. "But tonight," he said softly, "let it rain. The shadows fall where they ought, and we have earned a little silence." And so we sat there, the two of us, with the quiet crackle of the hearth, the scent of smoke and damp wool in the air, and the knowledge, rare but solid, that justice, this time, had not been outwitted. The next morning brought with it an unusual quiet across Baker Street, a lull that signaled not the end of a case, but the breath between battles. Holmes, however, was not one to waste such silences. I found him already at the breakfast table, poring over a thin stack of telegrams, each bearing stamps from Scotland Yard, the Times and, most curiously, a private investigator in Brussels. He glanced up as I entered, brushing crumbs from his sleeve. "Ah, Watson, your timing, as always, is impeccable. Tea's still hot." I poured myself a cup and raised an eyebrow. "Is the Vale matter not concluded? What more remains?" "Only the curtain call," Holmes murmured. "But the theatre, as you well know, is often at its most dangerous when the play is over." I looked at the top telegram. It was from Lestrade. Vale transferred to Holloway. No statement made. Barrister issued no plea. Prosecution preparing charges. Strange quiet from his associates. No retaliation yet. L. "That's what worries me," Holmes said, tapping the telegram with a fingertip. "Quiet can be genuine, or it can be strategic." "What of the Brussels connection?" I asked, gesturing to the foreign postmark. Holmes handed me the cable. A small inquiry I placed before the arrest. I wanted to know how far Vale's tendrils reached. Belgium is a haven for certain kinds of corporate obfuscation, particularly in munitions financing. I read the telegram aloud. MV linked to holding group ENSTRASYS. Nominal director only. True control routed via Shell. Firms in Liège. Same group attempted bid on British Ordnance contract under alias. Connection to Threshold evident. DuPont. I looked up, troubled. Then Threshold was never the whole picture. "No," Holmes said, "just the local face." Vale was the broker between foreign arms interests and vulnerable British contracts. Tremaine and his like were pawns, expendable. He stood, moving to the map pinned above his desk, where he had marked connections between names, companies, and locations like a spider web. With a piece of chalk, he drew a faint line from Threshold Engineering to a small square in Belgium, ENSTRASYS. They used Threshold as a front. When it failed, they folded it, shifted the assets, and waited. But Vale's exposure ruins the mechanism. There will be no more contracts, no more shadows. I set the telegram down slowly. Then we've done more than solve a crime. We've shut down an international influence scheme. Holmes smiled faintly. No, Watson. We've interrupted one. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a letter, unusual for its quality. Heavy cream paper, wax seal, ribbon tied. Holmes took it with curiosity and broke the seal. He read it in silence, then handed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, you have succeeded, it seems. The man you chased has been caged, the names exposed, the influence severed. But know this, the game you've entered is not played upon your cobbled streets alone. It is played in boardrooms, in embassies, in parlors where invitations matter more than law. You have earned enemies among men who prefer the world arranged in silence. You may have the last word in this affair, but the first word in the next has already been spoken. A friend." I looked up sharply. Is this a warning? A threat? Holmes's eyes narrowed. It is recognition, and perhaps something more. He moved to the fire, tossed the letter into the flames, and watched it curl into black ash. "I know the hand," he said after a moment. "You do?" He nodded. "Not the name, perhaps." but the mind, someone who admired the elegance of the scheme, even if they disapproved of its failure. This, Watson, is the voice of someone who plays a longer game. He turned back to me. But let us not wander into future battles. Not today. There remains one last matter of honor to restore. The following afternoon, Holmes and I paid a final call on Colonel Archibald Faversham. The old soldier had regained some color and strength, though his once proud gait was slower now, tempered by the lingering shadow of doubt that no man truly shakes off after such a siege upon his sanity. We found him seated by the hearth in his Kensington home, a folded newspaper on his lap and a brandy untouched on the table. "Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, "Dr. Watson, I've read the reports and the Times article." Holmes bowed. "We came not to revisit the past, Colonel, but to see how you fare in its wake." Faversham studied the fire. "I am restored, Mr. Holmes, or as close as a man can be once the mirror's been cracked." "You stood firm," Holmes said. "Few would have. I had doubts, terrible ones. But then I remembered a lesson from my days in Afghanistan. If you find yourself doubting your eyes, trust your discipline. It was the only thing that kept me sane. That and the knowledge that if I were to fall, others would follow." I saw Holmes's face soften, a rare thing. "You were targeted because you refused to be silent," Holmes said. "And now, because you endured, others may speak freely." Faversham gave a small, grim smile. "Let's hope they do." Before we left, Holmes produced a small envelope from his coat. "I believe this belongs to you." Faversham opened it. Inside was the anonymous note he had received in the early days of the campaign. The first veiled threat, written in stark block lettering, warning him to withdraw from public comment. "I recovered it from the man who posted it," Holmes said. "I thought you should see how little weight it now carries." Faversham placed it in the flames and watched it burn. Holmes extended his hand, and the colonel took it firmly. "Whatever history makes of this, Colonel," Holmes said, "you may rest knowing you were not silent when it mattered most." That evening, we returned to Baker Street beneath a setting sun that scattered gold across the rooftops of London, as though the city itself exhaled after weeks of holding its breath. Holmes seemed reflective as he hung up his coat and settled once more into his armchair. "I sometimes think, Watson," he said, "that the most dangerous crimes are not those written in blood, but those written in ink." He gestured toward the fire. "Lies whispered through forged contracts, reputations undone with doctored accounts, honor drowned in paper." I nodded. "And yet this time, the truth prevailed." "Yes," Holmes said quietly, "but not by chance, by pressure, by resistance, and by witnesses willing to endure it." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Would you believe, Watson, that I envy Colonel Faversham?" I stared. "You?" Holmes opened one eye and smiled faintly. He walked through madness and came out with his honor intact. That, my friend, is a rare and enviable thing. We sat together, then, in rare and companionable silence as the fire dwindled and the shadows lengthened once more. No longer threatening, but natural, as they should be. And outside, London moved on, its wheels of commerce grinding, its political rooms humming, and somewhere, no doubt, another scheme already taking root. But for now, Baker Street was quiet, and the man in the rain without a shadow had finally stepped into the light. The case of Colonel Faversham and the man without a shadow had, in Holmes's own phrase, resolved itself into clarity, though clarity never guaranteed comfort. Though the machinery of justice had begun to turn with Vell's arraignment and the unraveling of Threshold's connections, Holmes remained vigilant, convinced that a deeper current still ran beneath the apparent stillness. It was on the 9th day following Vell's arrest that current again stirred. We were finishing a late breakfast when a discreet tap came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a card on a silver tray. Holmes took one look at it, and his expression sharpened. He held it out to me without a word. Baron Almeric von Draustein, Attaché, Imperial Embassy of Austro-Hungary. Private diplomatic suite, Claridge's Hotel, a baron, I said, taking the card. And an attaché? What on earth would bring an Austro-Hungarian diplomat to your door? Holmes was already on his feet, reaching for his coat. The very thing I was hoping for, Watson. A reaction. You expected foreign interest? I hoped for it. Vell was merely a broker, remember. A conduit. We exposed one end of the scheme, but if the other end, the buyers, the foreign sponsors, reach out, it is to recover or to warn. Either is useful. A quarter of an hour later, we were shown into a private parlor at Claridge's, where we were greeted by a man of impeccable bearing. Baron von Draustein was tall, thin, with a waxed mustache and an unnervingly expressionless face. His attire was perfect down to the gleam on his cufflinks, but his eyes lacked the stillness of true calm. They flickered, watchful. "Mr. Holmes?" he said in lightly accented English, gesturing to two chairs opposite his own. "And Dr. Watson, I thank you for accepting my invitation." "You are welcome," Holmes said, settling, "though I must confess curiosity as to your purpose." "Diplomacy often intersects with inquiry," the Baron said, "particularly when trade and reputations are involved. Your recent exposure of Mr. Vell has caused a stir beyond your charming island." "Indeed." Holmes's voice was neutral. "The firm you unmasked, Threshold Engineering, was of considerable interest to certain groups on the continent. Not because of the weapons, but because of the access they represented. Access to contracts, procurement, logistics. It is the structure, not the steel, which others find profitable." "Then you are here on behalf of your government?" I asked. The Baron allowed a trace of a smile. "Let us say I speak for certain concerns. They would prefer the matter not continue. There is a risk that further inquiries might disturb long-standing arrangements, political and commercial. It is, in a word, inconvenient." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "You are suggesting I stop?" "I'm inviting you to close this chapter. You have won your victory. The public is satisfied. Let sleeping schemes lie." There was a pause. Holmes stood. "Baron, I thank you for your candor, but I am not a clerk of convenience, nor a politician to be bribed with silence. I investigate truth wherever it leads." Von Draustein's smile faded. "Truth," he said softly, "is a luxury in diplomatic circles." "Then I'm fortunate not to dwell in them," Holmes said. He turned, and I followed. But as we reached the door, the Baron added in a quiet, cool tone, "Be careful what webs you untangle, Mr. Holmes. You may find yourself trapped within one." Holmes did not respond. We exited into the London rain. "I believe we've just been warned by a foreign intelligence agent," I muttered as we returned to Baker Street. "No," Holmes said. "We've been measured. Draustein wasn't warning us. He was assessing how much further we intend to push. If we back away now, they'll know we can be dissuaded. If we continue, they'll escalate." "And you intend to continue?" Holmes stopped abruptly beneath the awning of a tobacconist's and turned to me. "Watson, we have uncovered a network designed not just to exploit military contracts, but to manipulate foreign policy under the guise of industry. Tremaine, Vell, Threshold, each was a spoke in a wheel that turns quietly across borders. Yes, I intend to continue, but now we must tread with exceptional care." Back at Baker Street, Holmes sent off a coded telegram to Mycroft, a name rarely uttered in casual company and even less frequently invoked in active cases. Yet Holmes had, on occasion, consulted with his older brother when political weight made his usual methods insufficient. "He must be made aware," Holmes explained. "Vell's operations may not have stopped with Threshold. They may have penetrated the very departments responsible for defense and procurement. And Mycroft can trace those shadows from above? I said. Exactly. Holmes spent the next 2 days deep in review, requesting files from the yard, compiling names from Vell's past cases, and even dispatching me to question 2 former ministry clerks whose names had appeared innocuously in the margin of Tremaine's confession. It was late on the second night that a reply arrived from Mycroft. It was brief, typed in code, and sealed in red wax. Holmes read it aloud. Am aware. Investigation proceeding discreetly. Do not pursue further openly. You have stirred embers that still glow beneath official paper. Monsieur Holmes's face darkened. Which confirms everything and warns us off. Of course, Holmes said. But warnings are, at best, a courtesy, not an order. The final development came unexpectedly. A knock at the door. Not Mrs. Hudson, not the post, but a messenger in plain grey, soaked from the rain. He handed Holmes a small box, unmarked, and vanished before I could ask his name. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a single item, a black chess pawn polished to a mirror shine. Nothing else. He stared at it for a long moment, then handed it to me. It's a message. From whom? Someone playing a long game, Holmes said. A reminder that we have removed only a piece, not the board, not the hand that moves it. And what now? Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, not his usual wry amusement, but something deeper. Grim, perhaps. Or resolute. Now we watch, now we listen. And when the board shifts again, we move. I watched him rise, the pawn still in his hand, and place it gently on the mantelpiece beside his pipe rack. A symbol, Watson, of what remains and what must still be done. The fire crackled behind us, casting soft light on the chess piece, and in that moment I realized the truth Holmes had sensed from the start. The man in the rain without a shadow had never been just one man. He had been a reflection, an emblem of the unseen forces that shape nations, manipulate honor, and crush reputations not with bullets, but with whispers. We had chased one shadow, but London was full of them, and Holmes, my brilliant, tireless friend, had just begun to hunt. The final days of October passed like the end of a fever. Slow, cautious, with a certain quiet dread beneath the surface, calm. London resumed its rhythms, but to Holmes and me, the city no longer felt entirely ours. It breathed differently. The fog on the streets now seemed to conceal not just crime or mischief, but ideology, intentional, organized, and far-reaching. The campaign to ruin Colonel Faversham had been defeated, yes, but as Holmes said one morning while staring into the embers of our fire, we have broken the mask, Watson, not the face beneath. Still, the public was satisfied. The press declared Holmes a national guardian, though he detested the praise, and Vell's trial loomed with growing anticipation. Colonel Faversham's name had been restored, George Harrow's reputation preserved, and threshold engineering had become synonymous with corruption in political satire and dinner party conversation alike. But for Holmes, victory remained uneasy. It was late on the 1st of November when Holmes received a final visit in connection with the case, one that would remain sealed in my notes for many years. A government brougham arrived without fanfare. A discreet footman knocked once, and Holmes descended without a word, stepping into the carriage alone. He returned 2 hours later with no coat, his scarf dusted with sleet, and his face a mask of irritation. I offered him tea, which he ignored. He went straight to the fire, standing before it as if to warm not his body, but his thoughts. "I've been requested," he said at last, "to allow certain pieces of evidence to remain unexamined." "Requested?" I said, incredulous. "By whom?" Holmes gave a faint smile, one that did not reach his eyes. "By those who believe that national interest is sometimes better served by ambiguity." "They want you to stand down?" No, Watson, they want me to forget. He said it plainly, without rancor. Yet I could sense his frustration, coiled beneath that singular calm he adopted when duty clashed with principle. They acknowledged your work? Of course, with veiled appreciation and full-throated hypocrisy. I've been congratulated for preserving the dignity of public institutions, so long as I understand when not to press further. And will you? I asked. Holmes turned to me, the firelight dancing in his eyes. I will, for now, because the cost of pressing would be the destruction of men only tangentially involved. The innocent often pay the highest price when the structure collapses. He lowered himself into his chair, but I have not forgotten, nor will I. On the 4th of November, Vell's preliminary hearing was held in closed session. Tremaine's testimony, combined with financial records Holmes had unearthed, proved sufficient to proceed. Bail was denied, and while the Crown prepared its indictment, Holmes and I at last allowed ourselves a few uninterrupted days of quiet. Or rather, I allowed myself. Holmes, as ever, found ways to occupy the silence. One evening, I returned from a walk through Regent's Park to find him bent over a sheaf of new correspondence, sorting it into stacks labeled Tremaine, Draustein, Foreign Interests, and one ominously marked Unconfirmed. You've begun a new index, I remarked. Holmes nodded. The chessboard, Watson. We removed a pawn. Now I wish to chart the knights and bishops who moved beside him. You expect further schemes? I would be disappointed not to, he replied. This is no longer about a single firm. We have entered the theater of statecraft disguised as commerce. He reached for a letter and held it up. This, unsigned, naturally, references a meeting in Geneva next month. Finance ministers, munitions brokers. One of the names on the guest list is familiar to me. From this case? From before this case. I crossed him once, years ago, during that brief and ignoble affair with the armored telegraphs. I paused. You never told me the details of that case. He smiled. Perhaps one day I shall. The final knot in the affair of the man without a shadow came not with a bang, but with a signature. On the 12th of November, a parliamentary commission released its findings on threshold engineering. The contract was officially annulled. The directorate was dissolved. A new oversight protocol was quietly introduced, heavily influenced by recommendations submitted, without credit, by George Harrow. Colonel Faversham, meanwhile, was asked to advise the War Office on procedural reform. I declined the formal position, he told us when we visited him that week, but not the cause. I'm too old for committee rooms, but not too old to remind them what honor smells like. He clapped Holmes on the shoulder as we parted. You did more than solve a mystery, he said. You restored something I thought I'd lost. Holmes, who never enjoyed praise, merely nodded and stepped into the rain. It was the 23rd of November, nearly a month since our first encounter with the Colonel, when the final letter arrived. It bore no return address. The envelope was pressed with no seal, only a plain red dot on the flap. Inside was a single sheet, upon which was written only, "The board has reset. Your move." I stared at it for a long time, then passed it to Holmes, who read it and said nothing for a moment. At last he stood, crossed the room, and placed the note beside the black pawn on the mantelpiece. "A provocation?" I asked. "A declaration," Holmes replied. "Someone has seen the value of our contest and intends to play again." I looked toward the fire, then back at him. "Will you?" He turned to me, and though his face was composed, I saw in his eyes the familiar glint, the same quiet fire that had drawn me to his cases from the first. "Of course," he said. And that was the end, and the beginning. The man in the rain without a shadow had been unmasked. The scheme had been exposed, the lie overturned, the names held to account. But in Holmes's world, there was never truly a final chapter, only pauses between moves. As I close this account, I do so with the knowledge that more will come. That the quiet gentleman in the corner of Claridge's, the unsigned letters, the chess pieces, they are not anomalies. They are symptoms of a world in which truth must fight harder and harder to be heard. But in that world, there is still Sherlock Holmes. And so long as he walks the fog-bound streets of London, shadow or no, there will be light enough to chase what hides in the dark. The final chapter of the affair, known in our notebooks as The Man in the Rain Without a Shadow, came not with another arrest or anonymous threat, but with a soft tap at our door on a fog-muted afternoon. I'd thought the case concluded, the game at least adjourned, but Holmes, ever the grandmaster of his own kind of chess, had anticipated one final move, and so it came. The visitor was unexpected. George Harrow, dressed plainly, absent his usual stiffness, stood at our threshold with a parcel under his arm and a look of tired resolution in his eyes. "I owe you both more than thanks," he said as Holmes ushered him in. "But what I bring today, I believe, belongs in your hands." He laid the parcel on the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a leather ledger, unremarkable in appearance but clearly well used. Its pages were thin and numbered in a spidery hand. Holmes opened it and nodded once, sharply. "The secondary accounts," he murmured. "Yes," Harrow replied. "Threshold's black ledger. I acquired it legally, barely. It was sent to me under the condition that I would use it to ensure institutional reform, not prosecution. But I've had time to think." He looked between us. "The reforms are happening, but the names, those who profited silently, most of them will escape scrutiny. I'd kept this hidden, believing it was safer that way, but I've come to realize that secrets, even well-intended, become shadows themselves." Holmes said nothing. He merely closed the ledger, placed it on his desk, and offered Harrow a small bow of genuine respect. "You've done more than most, Mr. Harrow. More than some ministers could in 5 careers. This ledger will not vanish into a drawer. Its contents will be used, but with discretion." Harrow nodded. "That's all I ask." When he had gone, I turned to Holmes. "This gives us everything, doesn't it?" "Everything," he said. "Proof of coordination between Threshold and its foreign investors. Names of intermediaries. Transfers disguised as consulting fees. And most damningly, the list of officials paid to look away." "And you'll turn it over to Mycroft?" "In time," Holmes replied, "but not before I ensure it cannot be buried." He leaned back, eyes distant. "Watson, this case began with a man who lacked a shadow, a simple impossibility that revealed a carefully orchestrated crime. But it ends with something rarer, a man choosing to step into the light when it was easier and safer to remain hidden." I considered this for a moment. "Faversham, then Harrow." "Yes. The victims of this affair were not those who were harmed physically, but those whose character was tested. And both passed." "And Tremaine?" Holmes was silent for a long moment. "Tremaine was clever. Too clever. But he made one fatal error. He believed that the truth was a tool to be shaped, not an absolute. In the end, it was not his illusion that undid him. It was his underestimation of conviction. Faversham's, Harrow's, even yours and mine." He stood then, and with unusual ceremony, took the black pawn from the mantelpiece and placed it gently inside the ledger. Then he bound the cover tight with string and sealed it with wax. "One day," he said, "this will be opened by another. Perhaps after we are gone. And when it is, it will tell not just of corruption, but of resistance." A knock at the door interrupted our thoughts. It was Lestrade, flushed and windblown. "Just had word," he said breathlessly. "Vels resigned his defense. Rumors say he intends to disappear quietly, but he's not out of our reach yet." Holmes smiled faintly. "Number, he's not." As Lestrade left, Holmes looked after him with something like amusement, then turned back to me. "You know, Watson, there was a time when I believed reputation to be the enemy of justice. That sentiment clouded judgment. But now I see, it is not fame that hinders truth. It is fear of losing standing, influence, the illusion of certainty. And that fear is precisely what must be confronted." He stepped to the window, looking out at the street where rain fell lightly on the cobbles. "This city will always produce more shadows," he said, "but for each one that darkens the doorstep, I shall strike a match." And with that, he turned back to the fire, his silhouette framed by the golden light, and I, as always, took up my pen, resolved to record the truth of what we had seen, and to remember that even in a world of shadows, the light, however small, is never without power.